Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I imagine a few others may trickle in in the next few minutes. Good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. I'm both delighted and honored to be hosting this event today, along with Civic, the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. Last year, we hosted a similar event here dealing with Afghanistan, which was very successful. As you all know, armed conflict in northwest Pakistan has been a reality for a number of years. The army has been staging operations against militants. Extremists have been launching deadly attacks. The United States has been deploying drones. This has continued over the last few weeks, even as the country struggles to recover from last summer's catastrophic flooding. For example, militants have launched a number of deadly attacks, and U.S. drone operations have intensified. In September last month, 21 such attacks, I believe 21 such attacks took place, marking a new monthly record. And as always, it's the civilians that suffer. They've been injured, killed, displaced, deprived of their livelihoods. And while we know that civilians have suffered greatly in Pakistan, it's been hard to get a very clear picture, simply because much of this happens in such remote, inaccessible, and dangerous parts of the country. So with that in mind, I think we should all be very grateful for Civic's new report on civilian casualties in Pakistan, which is sitting outside, which provides quite a comprehensive and sobering portrait of the situation on the ground. So today we'll be hearing from Christopher Rogers of Civic. He's the report's researcher and writer. He'll be discussing its findings, and we'll also hear from Huma Yousaf, the Wilson Center's Pakistan scholar, and as many of you probably know, a columnist, among other things, with the venerable Dawn newspaper of Pakistan. She'll offer some broader context. I won't say anything else about them because you should have their bios in front of you. So before we hear from them, their two presentations and Q&A, just wanted to turn things over to Sarah Holwinski, director of Civic, who will say a few words.
Hi, I'm going to say a few words in 60 seconds or less because I really want to get to the findings of this report. Civic Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict was founded in 2003 actually, by Marla Ruzicka, who was a young woman that was killed in Iraq subsequently in 2005, working for Iraqi war victims. And we have since taken on Afghanistan, Somalia, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And we've been blessed to have the support of Harvard Law School and University and Fellowship in getting Chris Rogers to do this work in Pakistan over the past year. And when it was first proposed to us and we said, you know, what is it? We were asked, what is the next conflict you all want to take on? Chris came to us and said, Pakistan. And I said, no way, you are not going to Pakistan. I was very worried about it. It sounded like an extremely complicated thing to do. To be based in Islamabad was fine, but then to go into the Northwest and actually talk to war victims, figure out what they were thinking and feeling, and then bring those interviews and findings back to the government just seemed incredibly difficult and complicated, far more than what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I am very, very pleased and proud to be presenting this report today on behalf of Civic. And Chris has done such an amazing job in being able to get and map out how civilians are being harmed and the help that they are or are not getting. Civic works to get warring parties to help the civilians they've harmed. And so with this report, we really want to change lives. So you have the report in front of you, but this begins for us the next months and years of hard advocacy work in DC and Islamabad to actually make it count for Pakistanis. So thanks for being here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much to Michael and others here at Woodrow Wilson for inviting me to speak and present about this report. And thank you to Uma for contributing as well. And I look forward to her comments and everyone else's questions and answers and a good discussion, hopefully afterwards. So, as Sarah mentioned, I've been working in Pakistan for the past year or so, conducting interviews with civilian victims throughout the country, primarily focused on the conflict in the Northwest in Fatah and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. We conducted over 160 interviews with direct victims of the conflict, meaning persons who had either lost family members, been seriously injured themselves, or lost homes as a direct result of the fighting of the conflict. So firstly, I'd just like to briefly discuss a couple of our findings, and then I'd like to briefly go over some of the humanitarian and strategic implications of our report. Firstly, I think one thing that's quite surprising to many people is that there are more civilian casualties in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. There have been over 2,100 civilian deaths from terrorism alone in Pakistan in 2009. In Afghanistan, from all forms of violence, conflict-related violence, there were just over 2,400 in that same time period. So what we've found is significant numbers of casualties in addition to terrorism in Pakistan, coming from Pakistani military operations such as airstrikes, artillery bombardment, crossfire with militants, as well as drone strikes and other conflict-related violence. So putting those figures together with what we already know the picture looks like from terrorism, it's quite clear that the number of civilians dying in Pakistan is actually greater than that in Afghanistan. Second, it's almost certain that U.S. drone strikes cause more civilian casualties than the U.S. has admitted thus far. The U.S. claimed just recently that this year there's been less than 10 non-combatant deaths in drone strikes, and none since this recent upsurge beginning in the early parts of September. They also claimed that from January 2009 to about March 2010, that there had been 20 or so non-combatant deaths. But in our investigations, we investigated 9 cases and uncovered 30 civilian deaths, 14 of whom were women and children, all since 2009, which I think casts serious doubt on these estimates put forth by U.S. officials. One case in particular that I think is interesting to highlight was actually the first drone strike of the Obama administration. 3 days after President Obama was inaugurated on January 23, 2009, a missile hit a house in South Waziristan, killing a pro-government peace committee member as well as 4 members of his family. We were lucky enough to actually get documentation from the family itself that was issued by the Pakistani government attesting to their civilian status and describing the incident, which I think gives even further credence to that case in particular. Just to make a couple comments on our interviews with drone victims. I think firstly it's important to emphasize that we believe that these are the first interviews and testimonials with drone victims themselves. And those that we interviewed, somewhat unsurprisingly, I think were all opposed to the drone strikes quite strongly. But I also think that their views were a bit more nuanced than that, and more nuanced than the drone debate I think generally suggests. Many acknowledged that the drones actually did strike the Taliban, but they insisted that civilians like themselves were also often being caught up in the strikes. Victims also complained or criticized the strikes as not being very effective in the long term. They believed that while in individual strikes you may be hitting and killing militants, for them, and particularly from their perspective on the ground, the situation hasn't gotten any more secure. It's only gotten less secure, and more militants are in their areas. Third, the need of survivors is urgent, and in most cases, war victims demanded but received little or no help. I think what's surprising when you speak with victims is the diversity and unexpected nature of many cases, how losing a limb or a death in a family can affect people in very different ways, and how each victim has their own story. Just for example, in one case, a widow from SWAT who lost her husband during the operations actually did receive a compensation from the government. However, as a woman, she was unable to use that compensation on her own, and even to access it, she needed to go through a male family member who had a bank account who was able to deposit that money. And also being a woman in this cultural context, she couldn't invest or use the money on her own. So the male family members offered to invest the money for her in a family friend's shop, from which she would receive a monthly stipend, which seems like quite a wonderful success story of these sorts of compensation schemes. Unfortunately, weeks later, during that same operation, artillery hit this very shop, destroying the shop, and she lost her investment in that. And so it just goes to how hard these losses, and even when you do try to help, how hard it hits families, whom are in many cases already struggling with poverty and displacement. Fourth, civilians that we spoke to hold warring parties responsible for their losses, and they expect amends, expect some assistance in recovering from their losses. Our interviewees uniformly demanded compensation or assistance, and our interviews also showed that compensation did a lot to mitigate anger and, I think very critically, enhance the perception amongst those in these areas of the legitimacy of the Pakistani government as well as the military. Encouragingly, I think some compensation programs do exist in Pakistan, but there are serious gaps and deficiencies that mean most victims aren't receiving any help. The Pakistani government compensation programs are administered on a very local level. They're quite devolved, and in practice, they're quite ad hoc. We found that over 2,000 deaths had so far been compensated by the Pakistani government, and this includes not only victims of terrorism, which is what's been generally widely published or publicized in Pakistan, but also victims of collateral damage and military operations. But the gaps are significant. Almost none of those that we interviewed from FATA, for instance, had received any compensation. And none of those whom had been injured had received compensation, and many victims, including those from drone strikes, have no access to these compensation mechanisms. Finally, to return to the issue of drone strikes, I think it's important to emphasize that the U.S. and Pakistan both have an obligation to come clean about drone strikes. Both countries need to explain the basis for their targeting, how many civilians are killed and injured in these strikes, as well as Pakistan's level of cooperation and involvement. Transparency and accountability is also critical, but not only from the perspective of the public and leaders in the United States, but also from victims' perspectives, many of whom want acknowledgement of their harm, recognition, and answers for why they've suffered and why they've been targeted. I'd like to also highlight some compelling strategic reasons, I think, as to why it's important to address civilian losses. Defeating militancy in Pakistan requires, more than anything, building the legitimacy of the Pakistani government, particularly in FATA and particularly in these conflict-affected areas. I believe that this is principally Pakistan's war, and a key goal is to win the hearts and minds of the Pakistani population to support their own government. The U.S. has already dedicated itself to this mission through billions in aid, through Kerry Lugar, military assistance, and other forms of assistance, which are primarily aimed at building the capacity and legitimacy of the Pakistani government. I think addressing civilian harm should be indisputably part of this approach. It provides meaningful help for those in need. It extends the control and capacity of the Pakistani state in conflict areas. And at the end of the day, it enhances legitimacy of the Pakistani government and military in the eyes of the people on the ground. Left unaddressed, civilian harm, as our report shows, provokes anger and resentment. It undermines support for Pakistani military operations and facilitates militant recruitment. I think there's also important second-order effects, such as the willingness of civilians to provide intelligence and information, buy-in to local government institutions, cooperation with local government officials who are implementing development and political programs in conflict-affected areas. And in the long term, stability and security requires extending the state and governance structures into areas like FATA, which will require buy-in and support from local populations. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize 2 points. First, civilian casualties are a serious problem in Pakistan, both for humanitarian as well as strategic reasons. Losses devastate families and sow real seeds of instability in conflict areas, just as they do in Afghanistan and other conflicts around the world. Second, looking forward in Pakistan, I do think the prospects for change are encouraging. Though many, even in Pakistan and the international community, are unaware, the government of Pakistan, as we've detailed in this report, does have some existing compensation programs and has committed itself to addressing civilian harm. Yet these programs are ad hoc and underfunded, but with support from the international community, as well as the United States, and especially more attention to these issues within Pakistan itself, I think real reforms are very possible, which will address and help many of the victims of the conflict and lay a foundation for lasting security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Chris, for a wonderful presentation and an extremely important report. I'd like to start by reiterating the importance of this report. The issue of civilian harm, it resonates with the people. It has strategic and humanitarian implications, as Chris has just pointed out, but it remains one of the most neglected topics covered by the media there, and certainly one of the lowest priority issues for Pakistani politicians. What I'm going to do is respond to some of what Chris has talked about and sort of help provide a few bullet points on political context. Unfortunately, I think I am the pessimist at this table right now, and have I think it's going to be unlikely to see a major paradigm shift in the way that the Pakistani authorities and military think about civilian harm. And I don't think that we're going to see, despite the fact that all the reasons that Chris has presented, it seems it's a no-brainer for the government to begin and the army to begin addressing problems of civilian harm. But I don't think we're going to see that trend coming up in coming weeks, and I think I'm just going to try and provide some political context for why that's the case. Let me start with the Pakistan government. Chris and the Civic report are correct in pointing out that the Pakistan government is currently the only entity that's providing compensation to affected civilians, albeit on an ad hoc and inconsistent basis. But I think we should be cautious about our optimism that they're going to expand this program anytime soon. Firstly, because in the wake of the floods, there's simply no money to go around. Economists are predicting zero growth for Pakistan in the coming fiscal year, and expanding this program of compensation for civilians is basically not feasible, I think, at this stage. Already we have seen that when the government does provide compensation, they have been playing a little bit with their budgets and allocations. In many cases, compensation for civilians affected in terrorist attacks has been coming, for example, out of the Benazir Income Support Program, which is it's a targeted subsidies program for women, but they've sort of been siphoning money out of there for compensating civilians, and I think their room to wiggle like this is going to be massively reduced as a result of the flooding. It also doesn't help, given these financial constraints, that there really is very little political will to address the problem of civilian harm. I think by now Asif Zardari's quote from December 2008 from an interview with then CIA Director Michael Hayden has become infamous at this stage. When he was told about civilian casualties that resulted from drone attacks, he turned around and said, "Collateral damage worries you Americans. It does not worry me." And I think that we've heard similarly callous and disconnected statements from the interior minister of the country, from the information minister. There's this sense of, there are even officials quoted in this report who say that, if anyone is supporting or facilitating the militants, we're not interested in protecting them or guaranteeing their rights or their safety. And while this seems callous, I think that there is a very strong logic driving the government's stance on this issue, and that is that they feel that they are directly under attack. The state is under attack by militants and terrorists. Their government has been undermined by the activities of terrorists, especially in the year 2009. And so they do have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to the fact that anyone who is in any way facilitating terrorist activities, supporting or sheltering militants is guilty by association and is part of the problem that they have got to face on a daily basis. And so I think there's very little tolerance for semantics amongst the Pakistan government and its officials for who counts as a combatant, who's a terrorist, who's simply sheltering a terrorist, who's a militant, who's a sympathizer, who's a suspect. I mean, these are all terms that we hear tossed about by the media, but the government is not very motivated at this stage to sort of pass through that and come up with a way to differentiate and then address civilian harm where it's due. I also would like to remind everyone that this government has made stemming terrorism, sort of countering this militant insurgency, their political platform. They sort of came into power on this sympathy wave that resulted from the assassination by the Pakistani Taliban of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. And they are interested in sort of coming out as the government that saved Pakistan from this problem of terrorism. It does not serve them politically to have half the number of militants killed in military operations then turn out to be civilians and innocent bystanders. What they like is headlines that say 27 militants killed in Oryxai agency. That means that they're getting things done. And sort of passing through that to get to the facts of who was actually killed as a result of drone strikes or army operations. It doesn't serve them politically. So I don't think we're going to see intense record keeping and addressing civilian harm as a result of this. Of course, you're going to be thinking to yourself, but this is all very counterintuitive. They're going to win the support of the people if they go out and address issues of civilian harm and deal with the resentments and issues of people who are being affected by the war on terror. I think it's also important to note that, as Chris has pointed out, most of the civilian harm, most of the civilian casualties are occurring in FATA. FATA is not politically integrated into Pakistan. The tribal agencies have a separate political culture, and they don't have the power of direct representation and voting. This government did sort of launch the idea of sort of extending the Political Parties Act into FATA, which would allow political parties to campaign in FATA and would help politically integrate the tribal areas, and give the residents of FATA the power to sort of disagree with and voice their issues with the Pakistan government through the vote. Currently, that is not the case, however. There has been no forward movement on extending that Political Parties Act into the tribal areas. And so the resentment of the local population in FATA can in no way currently harm the Pakistan government. They don't have that power of anti-incumbency right now. And the person who gets blamed is the political agent, who's the sort of one step removed representative of the Pakistan government. But, he gets blamed as an individual. The Pakistan government does not get affected as an institution or an entity. So I don't think that in the absence of political reform, I don't think that the Pakistan government is going to take the sentiments of the residents of FATA very seriously. One thing to think about, which could be a recommendation stemming from the findings of the Civic report, is that the Pakistan government has repeatedly asked the United States to give it drone technology and to empower the Pakistan Army with the equipment and the training needed to conduct drone attacks and strikes against militants themselves. There's a whole host of political issues surrounding this transfer of technology, which we can talk about in the Q&A session, but I think that there has been some talk of providing the Pakistan government and army access to drones that can do surveillance as opposed to actually conducting strikes. And I think it might be interesting for the US government to think about making any transfer of technology conditional upon the Pakistan government putting in place a methodology for monitoring and addressing civilian harm in FATA. So that's a pressure point one could keep in mind. Let me move quickly on to the US government and talk a little bit about why they won't be forthcoming, I suspect, in addressing civilian harm in Pakistan. Chris has already mentioned the opacity of the drone strikes program. This is very tricky political and even tricky legal ground. The United States government cannot be asked to pay compensation for damages caused as the result of a program that it's not technically participating in, and that if it is technically participating in, it is doing so with the permission of the Pakistan government. In other words, I don't think the United States would immediately consider itself a warring party in Pakistan at this point. With deniability on all sides, it's unlikely that the United States is going to be the one to step forward and take responsibility for those strikes, and especially to take responsibility for something that it's not supposed to be doing and yet has permission to do. It's a messy situation. And I think one of the other things to remember is that some of these civilian casualties are occurring as a result of cross-border raids by US Special Forces, ground operations that are definitely not supposed to be happening. Offering any form of compensation or acknowledgement of that civilian harm would be tantamount to admitting to doing something that one is not supposed to be doing. It would create a political firestorm, which we've already seen the face of that in the aftermath of recent NATO incursions that led to the death of Pakistan Army troops. So I just don't see how politically the United States could manage any form of redress for civilian casualties. I also don't think that United States taxpayers are going to want to support payments to people who are the victims of drone attacks because they were in some ways facilitating or sheltering militants who those drone attacks were meant to target in the first place. I just think that this would be politically very tricky ground for the Obama administration. Would actually love to hear your thoughts on that, Chris, if you have any. Also, despite the logical reasoning, one would think that there's currently a huge problem of anti-Americanism in Pakistan. It's this wave of resentment against the United States for the drone strikes in particular. 68% of Pakistanis, according to a poll that was released earlier this year, think of the United States unfavorably. And one would think that logically, well, if the United States did sort of come clean about the drone program, reminded people of its efficacy in some cases, and then stepped in with compensation and aid for people who were affected as a result of the war on terror, that it would be a good marketing strategy, that it would win over a lot of respect and regard for the United States. However, in the current climate, the extent of anti-Americanism and the resentment against the United States is so high that I actually think that this would in some ways be counterproductive. And that compensation would be seen as an admission of guilt and wrongdoing and inappropriate action. And while this may seem a little overly sort of conspiracy theoretical of me, I'm just going to point to an incident in December 2009. There was a big blast in the southern port city of Karachi. Over 40 people were killed. And in rioting that ensued as a result of that blast, in the wake of that, over 5,000 shops and small businesses were burnt to the ground and looted. And with Pakistan's financial capital facing a loss of about $400 million as a result of that incident, there were concerns of sort of economic collapse and ramifications throughout the country. And so the US government stepped in and offered, 1 billion rupees in support for small businesses, which they were going to distribute to the American Business Council. At that point, the compensation was misinterpreted by the Pakistani public, by political talk show hosts, as proof of American involvement in that blast, even though this was clearly a matter of local politics, of a land mafia, of sectarian violence. But the end result was that everyone has gone away from that incident thinking, oh yeah, the Americans did the Karachi blast. So given their experiences with some compensation, I again don't see the US government sort of stepping in and addressing issues of civilian harm. And very quickly, I'm going to talk about the Pakistan Army's role in all of this. Firstly, it's just not in the Pakistan Army's culture to admit mistakes. They are not used to being scrutinized or judged or evaluated, and they're not going to like it if it were to start now. Also, the Pakistan Army has several sort of more compelling reasons for not advertising, recording, publicizing, and addressing civilian harm. The first is the issue of the Pakistan Army's methodology, its tactic of heavy bombardment, which is not suited to counterterrorism, and it certainly is not suited to the terrain of FATA, and it's largely one of the reasons why there is such high incidence of civilian harm. But the thing is, it's the only thing that our army knows how to do. And pointing out that this is the wrong thing to do will, A, be very offensive to the Pakistan Army. But more than that, the army is just going to turn around and say, fine, if you want us to do more precision strikes, they're going to turn to the US government and say, we need more equipment, and we need more training, and we need more money. And that, again, it's not going to fly with the US taxpayer. And frankly, at this point, that sort of rhetoric from the Pakistan Army is not going to fly within Pakistan, because there's increasingly this desire to see the civilian government empowered. And we are, even though it doesn't look like that, there are lots of good political forces at work to empower the civilian government and sort of help balance out this civilian military power struggle that Pakistan has contended with for the last few decades. So I do think that increasing aid for the US military, for the Pakistan Army at this point to help them clean up their tactics on the battlefield is just not something, again, that I see happening anytime soon. But more importantly, far more importantly, is the fact that the Pakistan Army has fought very, very hard to earn public support for operations against militants in Pakistan. And to focus on the high civilian toll of these operations is not going to curry favor with the public, and more importantly, it's not going to curry favor within the Pakistan Army, because the biggest battle the Pakistan Army had was an internal one, to convince its own ranks, its own troops, to go in and conduct these military operations against militants. To now have those same troops who were skeptical and hesitant in the first place dwelling on the fact that many of the people that they are killing are actually innocent civilians, or emphasizing the fact that the sort of toll of their military strikes are so widespread and so interconnected with issues of economy and health and this, that, and the other that this report emphasizes, it's not something they want to hear. And this issue of sort of keeping support for the military operations against militants alive within the Pakistan Army it's extremely important because the Pakistan Army has deep ethnic divisions within it. And we have a situation where the Pakistan Army is primarily a Punjabi institution, and it was built to sort of fight India on the eastern border. But the war against terror is being conducted primarily by the Frontier Corps, which is like a paramilitary organization that comprises almost entirely Pashto speakers who are drawn directly from the tribal areas and from, to some extent, from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. These are the Pashtuns who are going to be very hesitant to learn that their actions are causing such civilian toll in their own communities, in the tribal areas, in their own villages, their own extended families. And sort of having the Frontier Corps reconsider its role in the war on terror at this point would be very tricky and problematic for many reasons, and one of them is actually in the context of US-Pakistan relations, where the Frontier Corps has been identified by the US government as the sort of counterterrorism wing of the Pakistan Army. Over the last few years, they have received they are allocated to receive $400 million in equipment and training to help the Frontier Corps become the sort of counterterrorism force that Pakistan Army urgently needs, and $100 million of that has already been allocated. To have them at this stage change their mind as a result of having being reminded of the civilian toll would be so tricky for the Pakistan Army that I can imagine them wanting to continue to neglect and silence this issue of civilian casualties. On a side note, this is more sort of what I've just heard in conversations over the years with Pakistan Army officers. Providing compensation and taking care of the families of people who've been killed in combat is one of the ways that the Pakistan Army retains the loyalty of its troops. It's sort of the big bonus prize you get at the end for being a good soldier, is that you know your family will be taken care of, you know that if you're injured, you will be taken care of, etc. If the Pakistan Army was to extend that courtesy to every civilian, those distinctions of the cost-benefit of whether to sign up for the army would sort of start to evaporate, and I think the Pakistan Army really wants to hold on and make this idea of being compensated for any sort of problems you encounter as a sort of privilege of being part of the Pakistan Army, and they won't want to sort of distribute this privilege very easily. And the last point I'll just make, which Chris didn't bring up, but it is mentioned in the report, it's extremely important, is the problem of civilians being harmed as a result of extrajudicial killings. This issue has come up recently with the release of a video that ostensibly shows Pakistan Army soldiers killing some young men who are suspected terrorists. The authenticity of that video is highly controversial. But before that, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan has released reports indicating that the Pakistan Army has been indulging in extrajudicial killings. And I think this is a much broader and more complicated conversation that we can have. It can come up in Q&A if necessary. The first thing is, of course, the army should be discouraged from doing this. There's no question about that. But I also think it's worth asking why they might be doing this. And this, I just want to quickly point at the fact that there's really no other plan in place for what Pakistan is supposed to do with all these militants that it's apprehending in the course of military operations. There's a backlog of about 3,000 to 5,000 people in jails right now. The anti-terrorism courts in Pakistan are inefficient, corrupt, confused. They have legislation that is outdated or not really tailored to the war on terror and these circumstances. And then there isn't any trust in the judicial system and in sort of due process, because people feel that even if these militants are prosecuted and found guilty, they'll end up in jail, where they will either be bought out by a political supporter or, sprung out in a militant sting operation or something of the sort. So there isn't really any faith that these militants can be dealt with if they're handed over to the civilian authorities. And until the Pakistan Army is convinced that if it needs someone out of the battlefield, it has an alternative to an extrajudicial killing, I don't see that situation changing too much. And I think I'll conclude on that note. And I think Chris and I are both happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Chris for that for highlighting the report's findings, and Huma, thank you for speaking about the very difficult, complex context surrounding this issue. Why don't we go to the Q&A? Though, Chris, did you want to respond to Huma before we go to that?
Yeah,
Say
maybe
a few
just
things?
quickly I'll address a couple of points that Huma's brought up before getting to Q&A. So I'm going to miss a lot of things here. So firstly, I will say that I think you're completely right when it comes to the obstacle that the political situation of Fatah presents. I will say that I think KPK is different, and we certainly saw that in the work that we did. Firstly, access to KPK is there. You could get out to SWAT. You could talk to local officials. They would actually give me lists and names of dead and injured that they had collected from military operations. And that was something that was obviously much more difficult to find and do in Fatah, and also get that information for the government themselves. But I think you're absolutely right on, and I think we should come back to this in the Q&A at some point. But the issue of the governance structure of Fatah being under what's called the FCR, the Frontier Crimes Regulation, which basically is this vestige of the British colonial system, which it means that there's no political representation, there's no real connection between the people of Fatah and the central government and the people who really exercise control over those areas, especially the political agents. So I think that is a real obstacle. I think there's ways around that. We can talk about that a little bit more. But I also would like to point out that is not really the case in KPK, where you do have people who and politicians who feel who have constituents and loyalties, and actually they use compensation sometimes in a political way, but they see it as something that's politically advantageous for them in those areas. So I think that's something that you can work with, particularly outside of Fatah. On the issue of the issue of funding and so forth, and whether or not people would be willing to provide these funds for financial reasons in Pakistan itself, and then also on the U.S. side. I think, firstly, it's important to highlight, particularly when it comes to injuries and death, we're actually not talking about a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, particularly relative to military aid, but even non-military aid through things like Kerry Lugar, you're not talking about, proportionally a large chunk of money. And so I think that, then the calculation becomes, or I think what's important to highlight is that the potential gains from actually a very small sum of money can be quite substantial. So I think you get a lot of return on that investment, if that's a helpful metaphor in that respect. I also think that a better way forward there too is to think about it as a technocratic problem as opposed to the political implications. To look at what you have already existing in terms of compensation and identify gaps where it exists, where it's not just about money. Sometimes it's about actually just making sure the information is correct, improving the verification procedures, because people are getting money, right? I mean, in SWAT just a couple weeks ago, 800 people were compensated by the government for deaths. So it is happening. And I think that's maybe another point I would say as well, is that, again, this is actually happening already there. So what's being proposed, I think, is not something that's entirely new that would require completely different line items out of the budget and new dedication of funds, although would be additional funding. I think that's the case. But this is something that the Pakistani government already does and actually has administrative systems and practices set up to do. So I think that's very important to highlight. And when it comes to the U.S. side, I would say two things. Firstly, on the willingness of the taxpayer to fund these sorts of initiatives. I think that the U.S. has already done this in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's something that Civic has been very involved in for quite a while, and these programs have been very successful. And again, in the grand scheme of things, actually not that huge sum of money, but actually quite effective and successful programs nonetheless, and I think have been seen as worthwhile amongst taxpayers generally perhaps, but amongst policymakers and people who have to sort of divide up that pie and decide where that money goes. And so I think, sorry, there's a lot of things here. Admission of guilt, compensation admission of guilt. And the drone strikes, yeah, I mean, this is a problem, right? The issue of the clandestine nature of the strikes. I do think that's a problem. But I also think that we can think about creative ways to get around that. Firstly, I think as an advocacy point, it's helpful to emphasize that there are civilians who are being killed and they're not getting the kind of help that other civilians, say in SWAT, are, or in Afghanistan, and there's something wrong about that. And I think that that's a good leverage point when it comes to talking about the clandestine nature of the drone strikes, which this is only one of the really problematic consequences of, right? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why the clandestine nature of these strikes is wrong, I think, and this being an important one of them. But I think it allows you to get to that conversation and to push it in that direction. I think there's perhaps, creative, innovative ways to thinking about getting around that even. I mean, you could think of the Pakistani government actually providing compensation to victims in the same way it provides it to other victims in Fatah or SWAT. So it would be done through the Pakistani government. And if it became an issue of funding, then, I don't know. I mean, I don't really know, exactly how the mechanisms work on the Pakistani financial side, but you can imagine conditioning funding for column A on putting some money in column B, and the U.S. will give here. There's other ways you can think about how to do this to get around, which is the thinnest of all veneers of, clandestine whatever with respect to these strikes, which is, part of the joke of all this to begin with. On the compensation side, again, when it comes to funding and willingness to do this, the U.S. is already doing it in the context of housing compensation. So the United States put in this is it's a bit confusing as to what the status of this is at the moment, just because the floods hit right when this was going to happen. But a number of weeks before the floods, the U.S. committed to $85 million to provide for housing compensation, which would have been direct cash compensation to people who had lost their houses in the conflict in KPK and some areas of Fatah. And that's a sizable amount of money. I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of money. And I think that the Pakistani government was happy to have it. They were pushing for it, and the U.S. Saw this as a good opportunity. So I think that's evidence that there is a willingness on the part of the U.S. as well as Pakistan to invest financially in these sorts of initiatives. When it comes to, just as a small aside, on the point about the security forces and their compensation compared to civilians, that is absolutely right. I mean, in the Pakistani army as well as the security forces, the amount of, that's part of the bargain on some level, I guess, right, is that people are taken care of, and you do get, persons do get quite significant payouts. Basically like pensions that we'd have here under veterans or something like this. But those are pretty substantial, and again, compensation is already ongoing, and civilians get a lot less than that, right? And that, I guess I would say, I see that as a concern, but I think that it's actually the difference in amounts are so substantial that I don't think the Pakistani army or security forces really sees the expansion of these sorts of practices as in somehow eroding the advantage they get from offering these benefits. And on the Pakistani army, there's a lot of points to make here, but I guess one thing I would say, and I think that this is something that we're trying to do in our advocacy, is that, as you spoke about, the Pakistani army is not the most open institution in the world, and not the easiest to engage in, particularly when you're coming to them with unwelcome news or information. And so I think the way that we've tried to approach that issue is try to look at this as a political civilian side issue, right? Work within the administrative civilian political structures that exist and rely on, persons in power and interest in that side of things to try to get some of these things done. Which again comes back to the issues of that being non-existent in Fatah, frankly. But in other areas, I think that can be quite successful. And more generally, I think there are certainly obstacles to moving forward with something like this, and there's and there are certainly people who don't find it in their interest to go forward with something like this or compensation or pay attention to these issues, right? I mean, if they're not being paid attention to, it's certainly in their interest not to bring attention to civilian casualties from the Pakistani military's perspective. But the reality is that, it's always going to kind of be like that, right? The U.S. has they would prefer if we didn't talk every day about civilian casualties in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's in their interest. But there are other interests too, namely the voices of people who are getting caught up in these things. And we have an interest in I think, asking, what has happened to them? What do they think is owed to them? And how do we convince the people who do have the power to try to address what's happened to them? And so I think that, whilst there are, these incredibly challenging obstacles, the reality is that that kind of, to a degree, is always going to exist when you're trying to move forward with something like this. And so the best way to do it is to think about how you most effectively engage and advocate for these things and people who don't generally have power.
I think I'll just, for the moment, now we can open it up, just focus on the fact that one of the tricks we're getting into is that if the Pakistan government were, I'm just talking about drone strikes, I'll just focus on that for the moment. If the Pakistan government were to start compensating people who had been affected by drone strikes, they're going to turn around and say, why are you just compensating us? It's in your power to just make these stop. You're the one who's permitting them, it's our soil, our issue, just eliminate this problem as a whole. And I think that's why the Pakistan government doesn't want to get involved in any ways involving itself with acknowledging that it has any responsibility for the consequences of these drone strikes. And I think that this same game actually extends a little bit into any form of U.S. involvement, financial or otherwise, in providing, in helping address civilian harm. You mentioned the housing. My understanding is that that's come out of this very tricky little clause in the Kerry-Lugar bill, which allows for reconstruction. It's not being framed as, or am I wrong on this?
That could be, the program itself is definitely compensation. Now, there could be provisions within the legislation in terms of how that...
housing for the reconstruction effort, right?
Well, they're reconstructing houses, right?
Yeah,
but the question is, are they reconstructing anyone's house, or are they reconstructing houses that were damaged by the conflict, right? That would be compensation versus...
Well, there are all these, I've sat in on some of these meetings, and this development, one hopes it goes through. Everything has been put on hold, a lot of these programs, since the flooding, and I think one of the things one will have to see is if there's that political will to resume the programs that already existed once the post-flood tensions wear off and one has a sense of what they're left with, economically speaking. There are also, I've sat in on these meetings, and the United States is managing to do a lot on the ground through loopholes and calling things something and, slipping it in under Kerry-Lugar, which is the civilian package, and everyone's mostly on board with that at this point. But one of the problems is that there's increasingly a demand for transparency and plain speaking, both from the US and Pakistan sides on all issues. And so this approach of sort of playing to get the money out to the affected civilians is I think it's the way forward, and I hope they figure out how to do it. But at the same time, I also feel that at some point it's going to run into those same problems of what is the government saying, what are they doing on both the US and the Pakistan sides. And one other quick point on, what was my other quick point? Actually, I'll stop there for the moment, because I think some of this will come back up.
Okay.
Question.
Well, those are good points, all of them. Let me ask the first question, if I may, and I guess I'll direct it to you, Chris, but Huma, you may want to weigh in as well. In the report, there are recommendations that target the three, what you call the warring parties, the U.S., the Pakistani government, the Pakistani military, and the U.S. government, and also there are recommendations for the international community. But there were not any recommendations targeting the Pakistani people. So one thing I was thinking about is civil society in Pakistan, which, as we know, has a lot to offer, and also the media. What role do you think Pakistani people, particularly civil society and the media, can and should play? Now, you said before, I think, that the civilian casualty issue gets very little press in Pakistan, which I found very salient. So what should be done, what can be done, and will anyone listen?
Yeah, sure. I think that the role of civil society and media in Pakistan is absolutely essential in going forward with this. I think, in contrast to perhaps other areas, Pakistan is a huge country with a very vocal and powerful and vociferous media, and with a powerful state that is influenced by the media as well. And so I think that, this issue needs to be taken up more seriously by Pakistani civil society. I think there's a number of reasons why it's difficult to do that. The pervasiveness, frankly, of the Pakistani military and intelligence services, I think, creates a real chilling effect on these sorts of discussions and these sorts of issues. I mean, I myself know how the Pakistani military reacts in circumstances where, for instance, there was this bombing that killed about over 60 civilians in Khyber Agency near Peshawar, and I tried to get to the hospital to speak with victims. And the Pakistani military had already blocked journalists from getting in. They had armed guards on every single corridor where the victims were. I had a journalist friend who wrote about some of those victims, who was then getting calls from the ISI or intelligence people the next day, and so I think that makes it difficult, and I think we have to be very sober about the kind of environment that people have to operate in when it comes to talking about these issues. But that being said, I do think there are ways forward and ways to talk about these things that aren't as antagonistic or as provocative. But that nonetheless bring them these issues to the fore. I think, for instance, talking about them in relation to, because victims of terrorism is something that's talked about a lot in Pakistan. I mean, not a huge amount, relative to other things, but it is publicized quite a bit. And I think that if you try to loop it into that conversation, talking about victims of the conflict, I think that that's one way at getting into this issue. But more generally, I would say that it's absolutely essential that Pakistani civil society, gets involved and speaks up more on this issue, because otherwise there really won't be much movement.
I'll just add to that Chris is right that this is primarily an issue of access, and that particularly with regards to the media, they cannot do thorough investigative reporting on these issues because they just don't have access to most areas where the military is conducting operations against militants. The other thing, though, is that the Pakistan media right now is sort of embroiled in a very strange rhetorical conversation with the Pakistan government about issues such as like the Talibanization of Pakistan. And what you find is actually a very not sophisticated conversation where either the conversation is entirely about, it primarily focuses on drone attacks. I think that's worth noting, that there isn't a very sophisticated conversation happening in Pakistan right now about these broader implications of civilian harm, the sort of wide ramifications, things like how the medical infrastructure can be improved to help people who have been injured as a result of fleeing a military operation, things like that. This kind of sort of very subtle, broader implication stuff is just not being looked at. Access, but also in terms of interest, because the media is in this heightened mood right now to sort of just spout out anti-government rhetoric. As a consequence of that, the civilian casualties that are focused on are almost entirely as a consequence of the drone attacks. And there you find, especially in the Urdu language press, the local media, it's such an emotional conversation, and they sort of have the stance, of course I'm generalizing, but there's frequently the stance that everyone who was killed by a US drone strike was innocent. And this is terrible, to which the Pakistan government responds, no, they were all militants, we have it on fact from the Pakistan army. And the conversation sort of ends there, and this sort of head-butting exercise continues. And what you don't have is this sort of subtle investigative journalism that sort of passes out and sort of brings up issues like the semantics of, are you a terrorist if you were just the person who was giving a terrorist dinner and things like that. Those conversations haven't started yet in Pakistan because there's still this sense of confusion, and the nation is continually overwhelmed by this idea of how this problem landed up in our doorstep, and 3 years ago everything was going fine and dandy. And so there's still bigger questions right now about why are we even in this mess, as opposed to what are the subtle implications of being in this mess.
Okay, let's open it up now. We're going to have microphones, so I ask that you wait until the microphone arrives before you ask your question, and that you give your name and your affiliation so we know who you are. So, first question all the way in the back, the woman sitting, it's Pam Constable.
Hi, I'm Pam Constable. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'd like Christopher to explore a little bit in more detail the sort of political and attitudinal fallout of drone strikes on victims and on people who have either survived them or witnessed them. One of the things that critics of drone strikes say constantly is that every drone strike creates 100 militants, that there's this corollary between the damage done and the people killed and the conversion of Fatah into a hotbed of militancy. And of course, many, if not most of the militants, are from those areas. So there have been some complicated and confusing reports coming out. If you look at the New America Foundation study, it shows that there is a much more nuanced, as you were saying, response from people in Fatah. It's not all black and it's not all white. But I would really like to know more of what you found on the ground. What was the response of people? Does it make them angry? Do they understand? Is there blame all around? Are they blaming one side or another? And, the Army is still very popular in those areas. And some of the New American Foundation reporting found that while there was great opposition to foreign forces being in there and going after militancy, there was quite high support for Pakistani forces going in there after the militants. So as I say, there's a lot of confusing data. I'd love to know what you all heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, my sense is that, or my inclination is to push back a little bit against the assumption that every time someone, loses a family member from a drone strike, then they're picking up a gun. This sort of causal relationship that I think on some level or some basic conversations when it comes to coin motivates the discussion, I think should be questioned. And I'm not really sure. And particularly in the case of drone strikes, I mean, no one has any information like this, right? I mean, it was hard enough to get what we have here, which is just talking to people about what happened to them and how they feel about it. Never mind, asking those sorts of questions, particularly in any way where you can draw some, very hard conclusions. But I would be skeptical, and also from talking to people, it doesn't seem like, there was that sort of correlation between wanting to, say, join the militancy and having this happen to your family. So I would push back on that sort of logic, which I know is a very common thing in the press, both here and in Pakistan. But I would qualify that by saying, that again, firstly, people's views were nuanced, and they could hate the Taliban, and then recognize that the drone strikes often kill Taliban, but then still not like the drone strikes because, well, firstly, they'd hit them, and then secondly say, well, from our perspective, here in North Waziristan, right, we've had 2 years of drone strikes, only increasing. Has this made me less safe or more safe? Do I see more militants outside my doorstep or less? And I mean, certainly people feel less safe. And from their perspective, that's not a very effective strategy. Now, whether or not this disrupts operations in Afghanistan or Europe or whatever, I mean, those are different conversations to have. But again, to focus on people on the ground and how they perceive things and how they experience things, I think that's the reality. And another point I'd like to make on that is that, there are a lot of, again, like these sort of perhaps second order effects. I mean, I don't know precisely what one would call them, but, the idea is that, all right, maybe someone doesn't necessarily pick up a gun and join the militancy, but there's a lot of other ways in which these strikes prevent the Pakistani military or government or the U.S. government from achieving its objectives in these areas, right? So if a drone missile hits a village, I mean, I've talked to people who implement projects in Fatah, basically, not clandestinely, but quietly funded by the United States, but through the Pakistani government. And if you have a village that's hit by a drone strike, the next day none of their people can get in there, and now the project is on hold, or it will never happen again, right? How do you get, again, there's an intelligence issue as well. I mean, often in these areas, you want people to support the military, support and provide intelligence, and it's harder for them to do that if militants are more threatening to them, or if there is an environment where it's very, where it's mistrustful of the military. But again, I think that often the rubber hits the road when you try to extend governance and development into these areas, which is ultimately what's required. And at the end of the day, if you want to achieve political reform in Fatah, and extend the state into these areas, which I think is very, very key, these drone strikes really hurt your ability to do that. And it undermines the ability for local leaders, for tribal leaders to stick out their necks, take risks, and so forth on behalf of the people that they're connected to or representing in some fashion. And so I think that's definitely an area in which victims talk about it hurting and affects strategy and people's opinions. And just one quick last point on these various polls and so forth. And I read the New America one, and it's quite interesting and quite good, and I think it does do a good job of pointing out some of these nuances and differences in opinion. I think that's very important. One gloss on that I would like to point out, though, is that the drones, from my understanding of these polls, they poll everyone from Fatah, right? But the drones, 99% of the drone attacks occur in only two agencies, South Waziristan and North Waziristan. And for the last year and a half plus, they've almost exclusively occurred in North Waziristan. So, I'm not really sure. There's been a lot of this discussion when it comes to public opinion, the difference between sort of settled Pakistan and Fatah, and that being a big difference, which I think is absolutely true. But then I guess I would even say that there could be even another level of differentiation between people who are actually in the areas that are being affected, who actually have drones above them, like in North Waziristan, versus someone who's in Khyber or Orakzai, who really have no direct experience with these drones. So I think that's another consideration and perhaps grain of salt to take these reports with.
Okay, question, I think that's the gentleman, right in front of you. His hand's up. It looks like a brown suit. I can't. Thanks.
I'm Doug Norell from Catholic Relief Services, and I'd like to ask, or first a quick comment, that Carrie Luger Berman was mentioned as being a civilian-oriented activity. Technically, it's really part of a counterinsurgency strategy that the U.S. government has funded. The language in the act is loaded with some very good things from the standpoint of agencies like CRS, which want to see civilian control of development and not have it incorporated into a military strategy. But other parts of the act do show that indeed it is part of the military strategy. Nevertheless, some $700 million in the continuing resolution is probably going to be allocated for flood relief under Carrie Luger Berman. And my question is, does the relief that the U.S. provides for victims of flooding in any way help to build a more positive image of America in the country? And does it in any way countermand the negative impressions that come from the drone strikes? And that would lead us to further consider whether a different strategy that isn't so heavily militarily dominated might be a better way to win hearts and minds for both the U.S. government and the Pakistani government in what is generally talked about as a military campaign.
With regards to support for flood relief from the United States, I'll say it's actually too soon to tell. The United States has clearly emerged as Pakistan's biggest source of relief and aid in this tragedy. It was the most prompt, and it has consistently invited and encouraged other countries and the international community to supplement their own aid with more financial aid. I know it was a lot of people attribute Holbrooke sort of jibe at China for not paying Pakistan more flood relief aid, that sort of perhaps sped up the Chinese process of allocating certain flood relief aid for Pakistan. But it's too soon to tell if this is going to change the sort of general opinion of the United States and its supposedly expansionist agenda in Pakistan anytime soon. And I'll just remind you at this point that as the floods were ongoing and as the United States had already started pledging money to help flood victims, the media and the blogosphere in Pakistan was alive with conspiracy theories about how the United States had caused the floods using this strange technology that can alter weather patterns. So you still have this conversation going on ridiculously that, questioning whether America is responsible for this mess and whether it created this mess just as this PR opportunity. I mean, I've heard all sorts of crazy things coming out in this regard. So it's too soon to tell. But I mean, clearly the United States has come out as Pakistan's greatest partner in this. The drone strikes has also been evolving, I think, even since Chris was in Pakistan, because what has happened since September is that there has been an increasingly open conversation about how involved the Pakistan government and army is in allowing those drone strikes to continue in Pakistan. The first time that a Pakistani official actually admitted that they were all right with these strikes continuing was this September, when instead of directly commenting on the strikes, the information minister of the country came out and said that I'm not going to comment on the strikes, even though they've escalated to record heights in this month, because we need all the support we can get, because we don't have the capacity to fight terrorists on our own. And there was this strange sort of convoluted comment that came out of the government, which was seen as the first admission that, yes, we are on board with this. Since then, they've already talked about how this is a counterproductive tactic and how drone strikes should end. But what in the sort of broader public opinion, I think Pakistanis are wisening up to the fact that the United States cannot take exclusive blame for the drone program. That said, it remains highly, highly unpopular. And I think it's also just finally worth noting that the flood sort of mostly affected, yes, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but also the Punjab and Sindh, which are not affected by the drones. As Chris has pointed out, it's a very, very tiny area geographically that we're speaking about that feels the direct consequences of the drone attack. So that in many ways, in the Pakistani mind, these are two divided issues that may have nothing to do with each other. So Pakistanis, when drones come up, will continue to hate America absolutely vehemently. But when this flood aid comes up, they will concede that, yes, they have been helpful. But it's too soon to tell whether this is going to change the conversation.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, I'll just add that, I think it's important to emphasize that the areas that are flood affected are somewhat geographically different than the most conflict affected areas. So again, some overlap in areas of KPK and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But aside from that, I mean, FATA, these areas, especially where most of the ongoing military operations are, these were not in the flood-affected areas. And so, I think it's important to, and just as a sort of addendum to that, to remember also that there's conflict still going on in those areas. There's still over 1.4 million people displaced as a result of conflict from FATA. All the problems, flood day -1 that existed related to that conflict and displacement, et cetera, are still there. And now it's right that, it's a, unbelievable, disaster in scale, what's happened in the floods, but I think it's also important not to lose sight of all those problems that still exist and recognize that they're different problems in many respects and different people you're talking about providing aid to in many respects. And just, on the issue of winning hearts and minds, Huma's mentioned, I think, sort of alluded to how difficult that is in the context of Pakistan and the United States and the just incredible proclivity of conspiracy theories and, very difficult to manage one's image as the United States in that environment. But in light of that, I think it's important sometimes not to focus too much on how flood aid and other forms of assistance can win hearts and minds, of the average Pakistani to the United States, because I'm actually really not sure that that's, first of all, how possible or realistic that is, and secondly, whether or not that's really strategically what you need to do. I think, the real emphasis should be on ensuring that the Pakistani state, particularly the civilian side of government, has the confidence of the Pakistani population, and that a lot of the aid is directed at making sure that Pakistanis believe that the civilian side government and not the militants, or maybe not the military if it came to that, but I think that that's where a lot of the emphasis is on, and I think that that's where real progress can be made.
Could I just say that my question really had to do with the public opinion at large, and the media is not driven by geographic areas necessarily. There are things that happen in the media that are national in scope, and also that I am not personally a supporter, nor is my agency, of winning hearts and minds. We're in the business of trying to cooperate and partner with the Pakistanis to build their own capacity for better lives, including helping them to build stronger governmental institutions. And that, perhaps, I would certainly agree is where our focus should be. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the woman right there in the green. Yep.
Michael, if you will permit me to ask a question that really doesn't have an answer, and I need to explain why I'm asking this, so I need to explain a little background. Okay. My name is Ann Reese. I retired a couple of years from the medical service of the State Department. Before that, in the mid-'90s, I worked for a Pakistani NGO as a mental health consultant and trainer. After retiring, or in the past year, among other things, I've spent several months in Pakistan as a basically full-time volunteer for 2 Pakistani NGOs and a group of Pakistani private schools, again as a mental health consultant and trainer. Now, luckily for what I'm doing, I don't have to figure out who is who. That is, are you Taliban, are you not? Are you a bad guy or not? I train people, I meet with people who need help, and whatever it is, if somebody gets some help, that's okay by my professional standards. But the question is, really, how does one ever know who is really who, and whom to believe, and what is actually true? I find that extremely difficult with everything that's being discussed. I mean, the notion of finding out what does the general population believe, I think what Christopher has done to spend that time there is terrific, but I assume that you do not speak 4 or 5 or 6 Pakistani languages and have various interpreters. At some point while I was there, either last fall or this past spring, there was something on the editorial page of Dawn or the News. I don't remember which, but there was an article, a very dense article about who is who in the Taliban. Somebody, sort of 1 or 2 sentences about each Taliban subgroup, 25 or 30 of them in Pakistan and Afghanistan, who their leaders are, who hates whom, who is now banded together because of anti-Americanism, and so forth and so on. What I got out of that is there's no hope that I could ever understand what this is all about, nor do I, and I'm arrogant enough to think that 95% of Americans would understand even less than I do. And so when you look at, if my child is killed by a drone, whether I'm Taliban or some other thing, it's probably about the same to me that somebody has died. And so many things that I do, I have wonderful Pakistani friends and colleagues, some of whom I've known for 30 years. I mean, I think these are truly terrific, very well-informed, upright citizens who all speak much better English than I do, so, thanks to their education. So there's no question that when we're talking to each other, we understand each other's words anyway. And I truly believe that they are all honest and not Taliban and so forth and so on. But I don't know how one ever knows what the truth is, and I find that very discouraging, and it's fortunate I'm not doing the kind of work both of you are doing. I expect to go back in January and to work with these organizations again, and I'm looking forward to that. But if I had to do anything else, the politics and the ethnicities and the this and that seem to me to be so complicated that one can never understand them. That's the long. I mean, I'm not asking for an answer to that, obviously, but your any comments or thoughts, because you've each presented a vast amount of, I think, very important information and observations.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I mean, a question that doesn't really have an answer and is very difficult to get into. But I think maybe I'll just pick up on a couple aspects of what I think you're getting at, because I think that there are, how do you know what's going on? I mean, that means different things, right, at different levels. So how can anyone know exactly what Taliban group is doing what and who's with whom and et cetera? I mean, yeah, obviously, that's very difficult, especially for someone sitting in the United States, the average person, I mean, obviously this is, even, people who spend years, focused on this don't really quite accurately understand what's going on. But, I mean, I guess, you try your best in those circumstances. But thinking more or turning more towards, in practice, when you're on the ground and speaking to people, right, how do you know whether or not someone is telling you the truth, where they're coming from, et cetera? I mean, of course, I think that is a problem, definitely. And it's, I think it's a result of, complicated nature of Pakistan, but also being in a conflict environment where people have different interests and are fearful of different things and so forth, which you might not really understand or be privy to. But I think, I can speak from sort of, I guess practically some of the ways I sort of dealt with that, I guess. And I think you have to try to find as many sources of information as you can. Talk to as many people as you can, and also do things to and find different ways of getting that information. Talk to people whom you wouldn't normally think would be asked about something, but who lives there or might be involved, like on an NGO side, not on the security side or something, or working with an organization you wouldn't even really consider to be within sort of the ambit of these things, but nonetheless someone who does have good information. And you try to, at least the way I think about it is, you try to collect all that information and compare it against one another, consider who you're talking to, what their interests might be institutionally, personally, where they're coming from, languages that they speak, culture that they're from, class that they're from, and you have to try to compile all that and sort of cross-reference all these bits of information to try to come up with the best picture that you can. And I think that's one that is necessarily going to be somewhat qualified. But I do think that it's important to try to do that as best you can and to try to get that information, because if you don't, what you're left with is two things. Firstly, a situation in which you have a black hole. You don't know what's going on, which in many ways is what goes on in Fatah, which is tragic because many people are suffering there, and what's happening to them is not being heard. So I do think that there is an imperative to sort of get to that information. And secondly, if you fall to a place where you're way too skeptical of the ability to know something, this leads us, I think, down to what's very typical in Pakistan amongst certain elements of the society, which is this love of conspiracy theories, right? I mean, they thrive in an environment in which you have total skepticism of being able to know anything and taking anything at face value, or being able to go through this process of finding good information. So the reality is that I think you can do it effectively there if it's done well, and that it's necessary.
I'll just add one or two quick thoughts to that. I think you're absolutely right in that one can't know, and I think what's really important to remember is that it changes minute by minute. So the same individual can be good in one tribal agency because he is seeking the hospitality of pro-government forces, and he leaves his AK-47 at the door, and he has tea with the Pakistan army people, and then he goes back to his sort of home tribal agency, and there he lives in a village that primarily is at war with the Pakistan military, and he'll pick up his gun again. And you actually see this sort of, it varies moment by moment from mosque to mosque in one village. And I think Chris has touched on many of the ways in which someone doing a report or a journalist in those areas has to sort of pass through that and just keep context in mind all the time, and people are very good at explaining their own context. I find that they're very sophisticated and self-aware about being able to explain to you that here I am this man's guest, so I'm not going to misbehave, but there I am at war with them because they occupied my village or my lands without asking me, and their tank is now stationed there. And it really is, it comes down to these local personal details. And another thing I find is that often women are a very amazing source of information. They tell you very accurately. Like they don't get into definitions. They won't use words like Taliban or member of the Haqqani network, but they will say things like, my son carries guns from point A to B because he's paid this much by so-and-so. And it sort of brings it down into actual, like, tangible facts, what is actually going on, and then, we sort of extrapolate from that. But what I think one of the main recommendations of, one of the most important recommendations in this report is that there is this need, this very, very urgent need for definitions, both from the US government, the Pakistan government, the international community. Who counts as a good Taliban? Who counts as a bad Taliban? When do you sort of stray that line from being an active militant or terrorist to being one who hosts them or facilitates them. And I think the population there is craving for these distinctions. I think we all, someone like, I'm a journalist, I want that distinction. And I think that we have seen the success of it. For example, the Pakistan government has been very consistent since, I'd say, 2003 about saying that if you are working with foreign militants, if you're working with the Uzbeks, you're in trouble with us. And they have been extremely consistent on this one point, and they have not wavered, and they made that very clear, and they even made a list of sort of certain foreign militant organizations that Pakistan did not want on its soil and would not tolerate or have any sort of sympathy or negotiating room in that regard. And it is a well-known fact in all the tribal agencies and all the settled parts of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa that if you're going to mess with a foreign militant, you're probably going to see the end result of that. Since 2004, this has been the case. And so it has allowed people to make informed decisions. And I think sort of similarly consistent and clear outlines from all involved parties are needed to help us start passing through this.
Hey, the gentleman here in the yellow up front, you've had your hand up for a while.
Paul Kavika-Martin, Policy Director with Peace Action, formerly St. Freeze. Thanks to the Wilson Center and Civic for this report and conversation today. Most of your recommendations, Chris, in the report for the United States government are around drone strikes. And it's my understanding that drone strikes are primarily funded through Title 10 of the Army Code, which is all covert operations. And this is why we don't have a lot of information. Even many congressional staff have zero access to information around drone strikes. So have you had any conversations? Do you think there's any realistic chances that there's going to be any kind of changes in what's going to be discussed, what's going to come out around drone strikes? It's difficult to see how that might change around within the intelligence community.
I think, as we've discussed, this is a big problem, the covert and clandestine nature of the strikes, and also as Uma has pointed out, there are real interests that are aligned in such a way to make it very advantageous for the United States and particularly Pakistan to keep these covert. I don't want to delve into making predictions, I guess, as to what will happen. I guess I could point to a couple of areas where I think are sort of places for pushing for change on this. I think the legality of them, not necessarily in terms of sovereignty, but being clear about who's being targeted on what basis, what the legal process is for that, what the oversight is, particularly when it comes to. And let me back up for this. Let me back up real quick. I think the best chance for this covert issue of moving forward in some way is actually, ironically, the expansion of these strikes outside Pakistan. It's the notion that what is going on in Pakistan is setting a precedent for how the United States is conducting these strikes elsewhere in the world, and I would say also how other countries might conduct these strikes elsewhere in the world, but more importantly, how the U.S. is doing this and on what basis. So when you have this American cleric in Yemen, al-Askari, on what basis is he being targeted? What are his constitutional rights in these circumstances? And then through those conversations, because it's obviously happening outside of what we consider a conventional battlefield, this is an avenue to push for clarity on what's going on in Pakistan and why are people being targeted and how is that being conducted. Recently, there was these it became apparent, I think, through Woodward's book, as well as what it was about a week or so ago when the German nationals, a number of German nationals, 3, 4, 5 or something, were killed in a strike. And so I think that that's putting heat and pressure on the United States in this respect. I think the other avenue in which this becomes important is actually, again, on this distinction, how do you define people? It's important for a detention on detention issues, right? So the same legal conversations within the United States intelligence community going on over detention have real important repercussions for the targeting context. And so I think lack of clarity in both of these areas means that they're getting a lot of pressure from outside. And so I think that reverberates in both these conversations. And so, again, I wouldn't pretend to make predictions about how this will play out over time. But I think the way I'd like to look at it is identify areas in which, because I believe that the clandestine nature of these strikes is a very, very big problem for a lot of reasons. The civilian side, legal side, humanitarian side, etc., strategic side even. And so I think, what it's important to do is try to draw connections between what's going on in Pakistan and other areas in which advocacy is even more possible. And one, final qualification on that, and I imagine she's already spoken about this, but one of the real problems, though, is the Pakistani side, I think. They get, or the perception, at least in the government, is that they get a lot of political advantage out of being able to talk out of both sides of their mouth. The duplicity is incredibly advantageous from their own perspective. And so I think, when I think also, and this perhaps goes back to the first question, in terms of how to move forward with this, I think it's important to try to get this conversation right in Pakistan within the civil society, to get out of this butting heads of 99% of the people killed are civilian, and this is why it's wrong, it's a violation of our sovereignty, and no one's being killed, and this is okay, and it's actually really strategically advantageous. There's a huge middle ground there where there's a lot of civilians being killed, they're not getting any help, it's not a violation of sovereignty, but there's huge legal issues associated with targeting, and the basis for targeting and so forth, and discrimination. But none of that is being talked about, and so I think that there is a lot of room for that conversation in Pakistan to happen, and ultimately that has to happen before Pakistan gets on board with moving forward.
I'll just add one quick thing to that, which is I know that since September, when the drone strikes escalated, then there was this news of foreign nationals being killed in drone strikes, and then there was Woodward's book with the revelations that U.S. passport holders have been killed in drone strikes, that there was this collective sigh of relief within Pakistan, because everyone was like, this is no longer our problem. The Americans are going to sort it out domestically in their sort of political and legal system, and we'll just wait and see where the chips fall. So I think a little bit there has been, just in the last few weeks, and again, this may change because things in Pakistan change quite frequently, but I think there's an increased interest in Pakistani civil society, the media, but also in political circles, to see how sustainable legally and in terms of sort of popularity and human rights issues and that these drone strikes will be. And so I think at least on the Pakistani side, there's just been a sort of hands-off moment right this minute, where especially if this point gets taken up within the United States, that if U.S. passport holders are getting killed in U.S. Drone strikes, then something very strange is going on. So I know for the moment Pakistan is waiting to see how this plays out.
I've got time for one more question. So yes, the woman right in the back.
Just have one question to end on. We were mentioning earlier the flooding in Pakistan, and I was wondering, is it a zero-sum game in being able to provide help for flood victims and also to be able to provide help for war victims? How do we keep an emphasis on victims of conflict, and how can we make sure that there is still political will to compensate war victims? Because obviously flood victims need help. But ask that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, the first step is to look for areas in which it's not a trade-off, or it's not a zero-sum game. The housing compensation is one, actually. My sense of the way it's moving forward is that it's being expanded to cover flood victims as well. And so I think that there are a lot of people who are doubly affected, who lost their house or were injured or harmed in the conflict, but then were hit again by the floods. And so making sure that those people are getting assistance through the existing flood aid programs, as well as what was already in place for compensation and rebuilding in KPK goes forward. I think that's where there's a real overlap, actually, and the two can kind of reinforce one another. I think when it comes to the other areas, particularly Fatah, as opposed to Punjab and Sindh, where the majority of the flood-affected persons are, that's where things become a little bit more complicated. But I do think that, it's, going forward, we spoke a little bit about this floods issue before, that we have to remember that, again, while the issue of the floods is massive and deserves, all the attention and aid that it's getting, if not more, all the problems that existed right before the floods with respect to the conflict and the displaced and the civilians being harmed is still there. And not only is it still there, but it's ongoing, right? Outside South Waziristan, you have people who have been displaced and still can't return effectively for well over a year. People in Bajor for 2 years or more. There's still ongoing conflict in Koram, Orakzai, these other areas, operations still going on in which civilians are being killed, injured, displaced, etc. And so I think it's very important when moving forward with the flood aid that those aspects, that displacement and the effect on civilians in these conflict areas is not forgotten, is paid attention to, and then we look strategically where flood aid related interventions can also affect and impact and serve those people.
I actually think one point worth noting is that the mechanisms for distributing aid to flood victims are very similar to the ones that will be required to get compensation out to war victims. And one of the sort of silver linings of all of this is that a lot of funding is being provided to the Pakistan government to strengthen those mechanisms, to speed up the process of issuing identity cards to Pakistani citizens throughout the country, so that the flood aid can be distributed transparently, effectively, all of that. And I think actually in some ways, civilians who are affected by the conflict are going to actually benefit from this aid as a result of just simple bureaucratic infrastructure issues. And I also think it's worth remembering that while the flood has been one of the most overwhelming things that Pakistan has ever had to contend with, if you look at the Pakistani press, all the stories are back on terrorism, US-Pakistan relations, drone strikes. I mean, in some ways, we're already in a post-flood situation, for good or for bad. And so in some ways, the concentration, the main, the Pakistani mind and eyes remains in Fatah, in KPK, on the Taliban. And I think that conversation is not going to die down as a result of the flooding. If anything, it's the other way around, where while the money is coming in from the international community for flood victims, Pakistanis need to remind themselves that in some ways is a priority that they need to balance along with the war against terror. So I actually don't see it as much of a problem or a trade-off at this point.
Well, this has been a useful discussion, a difficult discussion, but unfortunately a necessary discussion, just because there's no reason to think that armed conflict will be stopping anytime soon in Pakistan. Civilian casualty issues will unfortunately be a very significant matter for many months and probably years ahead. So thank you to Civic, thank you to Chris and everyone with Civic for presenting this report. Thank you to Huma for your very insightful comments. Why doesn't everyone give me a round of applause for our speakers? Thank you. Thank you for coming. We're now adjourned.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's great. It was very good, I thought. It was a very good point about